There are moments in life when you walk away from a conversation feeling smaller, unsettled, uncertain. Yet no harsh words were spoken, no accusations were made, nothing obvious occurred. And still, something inside you shifted. You replay the exchange in your mind, searching for the exact sentence where things went wrong, but there is none. Because what unsettled you was not language. It was atmosphere, it was restraint. It was the invisible pressure of being made to feel incorrect without ever being told you were wrong. This is not the noise of conflict. This is the silence of control, a composed expression, a measured pause, a look that lingers just long enough to unsettle your certainty. These moments do not announce themselves as manipulation. They arrive disguised as calm, as maturity, as emotional intelligence, and that is what makes them so powerful. They bypass your defenses because you were never invited into a fight. You were simply placed into doubt. Over time, this quiet erosion begins to shape the way you speak, the way you think, the way you carry yourself. You start choosing your words more carefully, not out of wisdom, but out of fear of being misunderstood again. You soften your truths. You second-guess your instincts. You feel the need to explain what once needed no explanation. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin negotiating with your own confidence. This speech is not about blame, and it is not about confrontation. It is about recognition, about understanding the unseen methods by which power is transferred in silence, and how dignity is reclaimed not by raising your voice, but by reclaiming your inner clarity. Because the most dangerous control is not the kind that shouts, it is the kind that convinces you to doubt yourself while remaining perfectly composed. Tonight, we speak about that art, not to fear it, but to see it clearly, and once you see it, it can no longer own you. Silence as a weapon of authority. Silence has a reputation for being peaceful, even noble. We are taught that restraint is wisdom, that not reacting is maturity, that quiet composure is a sign of emotional strength. But silence, when used deliberately, can become something else entirely. It can become a force that bends the emotional environment without ever revealing its hand. When words are withheld at critical moments, when acknowledgement is delayed, when responses are minimal, when presence is reduced to distance, the silence begins to speak on behalf of the person who controls it. And what it often says is not calm, but command. In these moments, the silence does not feel empty. It feels heavy. It presses against the other person's thoughts, inviting them to fill the gap. The human mind dislikes uncertainty, and in the absence of clarity, it begins to search for cause. Did I say something wrong? Was my tone incorrect? Should I have stayed quiet? The silence offers no correction, no guidance, no reassurance, only space. And within that space, self-doubt grows. The one who remains silent does not need to accuse, because the other has already begun judging themselves. Over time, this pattern reshapes behavior. The person exposed to strategic silence becomes hyper-aware of timing, wording, and emotional expression. They begin monitoring themselves, adjusting their presence to avoid triggering that uncomfortable quiet. This is where the shift in power occurs. Control is no longer enforced externally, it is internalized. The silence has trained the mind to self-regulate in favor of the one who withholds response. What once felt like mutual interaction now feels like performance, where one person waits for cues that never arrive. The most unsettling part is how invisible this process is. There is no argument to point to, no harsh sentence to quote, no clear moment of wrongdoing. From the outside, everything appears calm. In fact, the person using silence may even be praised for being composed, unreactive, and above conflict. Meanwhile, the other person carries the emotional weight alone, trying to restore balance in a conversation that was never meant to be balanced. The silence looks neutral, but it is anything but. It quietly decides who speaks freely and who learns to hesitate. Silence used this way also alters the emotional rhythm of relationships. Warmth becomes unpredictable. Connection feels conditional. You may notice that openness is met with distance, while restraint is rewarded with brief approval. Slowly, expression is reduced. You share less, explain more, and apologize for things you do not fully understand. The silence becomes a boundary you tiptoe around, careful not to cross it again. And in doing so, you surrender a piece of your authenticity, not because you were asked to, but because the environment demanded it. Yet silence only holds power when it is misunderstood. The moment you recognize it as a method rather than a mystery, its influence weakens. Not every pause is wisdom. Not every lack of response is maturity. Sometimes it is simply a refusal to engage openly while still expecting emotional influence. Awareness restores choice. You no longer rush to fill the quiet. You stop offering explanations to earn a reaction. You allow the silence to remain where it belongs, outside of you, not inside your thoughts. True authority does not require others to doubt themselves. True strength does not rely on discomfort to maintain control. When you stop internalizing silence as judgment, you reclaim your footing. You speak when you choose. You pause when it serves you. And the silence, once used to unsettle you, becomes neutral again, just a space, no longer a weapon. The subtle rewriting of reality. Reality is not always challenged directly. More often, it is adjusted quietly, one expression at a time, until certainty begins to feel unstable. The most effective form of influence does not argue against your perspective. It simply never fully agrees with it. A story you tell is met with a slight pause. An experience you describe is acknowledged but not affirmed. Nothing is denied outright, yet nothing is validated either. And in that unresolved space, doubt begins its slow work. You start wondering if your understanding is incomplete, if your interpretation is flawed, if your memory is unreliable. Not because anyone said so, but because the environment subtly encourages you to question yourself. This process is powerful precisely because it avoids confrontation. There is no open disagreement to defend against, no accusation to respond to, no clear line where one reality ends and another begins. Instead, there is ambiguity. And ambiguity, when repeated, trains the mind to hesitate. You begin to preface your thoughts with uncertainty. You soften your statements. You add disclaimers before speaking, as though asking permission for your own perception. Over time, confidence does not disappear suddenly. It erodes quietly and politely, until second-guessing feels like caution rather than loss. As this pattern continues, the balance of authority shifts. The person who never fully confirms your reality becomes the unspoken reference point. You start watching their reactions closely, searching for clues. A nod feels like approval. A neutral expression feels like correction. Without realizing it, you begin measuring truth by their response rather than your own experience. This is how reality is rewritten, not by replacing facts, but by repositioning who gets to interpret them. Your inner compass starts pointing outward instead of inward. What makes this especially difficult to identify is its subtlety. From the outside, nothing appears wrong. Conversations sound calm. Words remain respectful. There are no raised voices or obvious dismissals. In fact, the atmosphere may feel intellectual, composed, even refined. But internally, the effect is destabilizing. You replay conversations repeatedly, trying to locate the moment you misunderstood. You feel the need to clarify, to explain, to prove that what you experienced was real. And the more you explain, the less certain you feel. Eventually, this quiet distortion affects how you relate not just to others, but to yourself. You hesitate before trusting your emotional responses. You wonder whether your discomfort is justified or exaggerated. You question your instincts, even in moments that once felt clear. The world becomes slightly out of focus, not enough to alarm you, but enough to keep you dependent on external validation. And that dependence is the true outcome of this method. When you no longer trust your own perception, you become easier to guide, easier to redirect, easier to silence without resistance. But clarity returns the moment you recognize the pattern. Reality does not require constant confirmation to be valid. Your experiences do not need unanimous agreement to be true. The absence of affirmation does not automatically mean error. When you stop treating ambiguity as evidence against yourself, its power dissolves. You no longer chase certainty through another person's reactions. You allow your understanding to stand on its own. Reclaiming reality is not about arguing louder or proving more. It is about grounding yourself in what you know, feel, and observe. It is about honoring your perspective without demanding permission for it to exist. When you do that, the subtle rewriting loses its effect. The world sharpens again. And you remember that your perception was never broken. It was simply being questioned by design. Emotional withholding, disguised as maturity. Emotional distance is often praised as composure. Detachment is mistaken for depth. The ability to remain unmoved is framed as wisdom, as though restraint alone is proof of strength. But there is a difference between emotional regulation and emotional withdrawal. One creates safety, the other creates uncertainty. When warmth, reassurance, and presence are selectively withheld, not as a momentary need for space but as a pattern, the atmosphere changes. Connection becomes conditional. Expression feels risky, and the person on the receiving end begins to adapt, not toward health, but toward survival. At first, this withholding is subtle. A once consistent response becomes delayed. Affection is reduced without explanation. Engagement feels thinner, quieter, less available. Nothing is announced, nothing is discussed. And because there is no open rejection, the mind searches for reasons. You assume responsibility. You wonder if you asked for too much, shared too openly, or misread the closeness that once felt mutual. This is how emotional availability becomes a reward rather than a shared space, something you begin trying to earn back through restraint and self-silencing. Over time, this creates a shift in behavior. You become careful with your emotions, measuring what is safe to express and what must remain hidden. You sense that openness leads to distance, while calm restraint restores temporary balance. And so you learn to compress yourself. You offer less truth and more control. You manage your tone, your timing, your reactions, not because you have found peace, but because peace now seems dependent on not disturbing the other person's emotional comfort. The relationship feels calm on the surface, but underneath, it is built on quiet tension. What makes emotional withholding particularly effective is how easily it can be mistaken for maturity. The person withdrawing may appear thoughtful, controlled, even admirable. They may speak of boundaries, independence, or inner strength. Meanwhile, the emotional labor shifts entirely onto the other person. You become the one adjusting, waiting, interpreting, hoping. The silence is not empty, it is directive. It teaches you which parts of yourself are welcome and which parts should remain unseen. As this pattern continues, self-expression begins to feel unsafe. You may notice that you hesitate before sharing joy, concern, or vulnerability. You rehearse conversations in your mind, editing yourself before you speak. You feel relief when interactions go smoothly, even if they feel distant. This is not connection, it is compliance. And compliance, when disguised as calm, can quietly dismantle self-trust. You begin confusing emotional absence with stability and distance with respect. Yet emotional maturity does not require another person to shrink. True steadiness allows room for expression without punishment. It does not ration warmth to maintain control. The moment you recognize emotional withholding for what it is, a method, not a virtue, you regain clarity. You stop personalizing the absence. You stop working to earn basic presence. You understand that your emotions are not excessive simply because someone else avoids them. Reclaiming yourself in this dynamic begins with permission to feel fully, to express honestly, and to recognize that emotional availability is not a luxury. You do not need to become colder to be respected. You do not need to silence your inner world to maintain peace. When you choose authenticity over adaptation, the imbalance becomes visible, and once it is visible, it loses its power. What remains is a simple truth. Real maturity does not withdraw connection, it sustains it. When body language becomes silent judgment, words are only one layer of communication. Long before a sentence is spoken, the body has already delivered its message. A slight shift in posture, a glance that lingers too long or ends too quickly, a subtle exhale at the wrong moment. These signals pass beneath the surface of conversation, yet they shape its emotional outcome. When body language is used deliberately, it can guide perception without ever entering the realm of debate. Nothing is said, nothing is denied, and still a clear message is received. You feel evaluated, you feel misplaced, you feel as though you have disrupted an unspoken order. What makes this form of influence so effective is its deniability. A look can always be dismissed as coincidence. A sigh can be explained as fatigue. A turned shoulder can be justified as distraction. And because these gestures carry no official meaning, the recipient is left alone with their interpretation. You hesitate to respond, unsure whether what you sensed was real or imagined. That hesitation is where power settles. The moment you begin questioning your perception of discomfort, you step away from your own intuition and towards self-correction. Over time, repeated exposure to these signals conditions behavior. You become alert to micro-reactions, scanning faces and movements for approval or disapproval. You adjust your tone mid-sentence. You shorten your thoughts. You abandon ideas before fully expressing them, not because anyone asked you to, but because you learned, silently, what seemed unwelcome. This is how expression narrows without instruction. The body language becomes a quiet set of rules, and you begin following them instinctively. This unspoken judgment often feels heavier than words because it offers no resolution. A sentence can be challenged, a statement can be clarified, but posture and expression leave no space for dialogue. You cannot argue with a pause. You cannot reason with a look. The message remains suspended, unresolved, and because it is unresolved, it lingers. You replay the interaction later, trying to identify the exact moment you lost alignment, the point where you should have said something differently. The body language has already done its work. It has planted doubt without leaving a trail. In environments where this pattern persists, emotional safety slowly erodes. You may notice that you feel tense before speaking, even when discussing neutral topics. You sense a need to be brief, agreeable, and efficient. Expression becomes transactional rather than genuine. The body language has trained you to minimize yourself, not through force, but through subtle correction. And because there was no open conflict, the adjustment feels self-initiated, even though it was shaped externally. Yet not all non-verbal communication is harmful. Presence can convey respect. Stillness can offer safety. The difference lies in intention and impact. When body language consistently creates discomfort, self-doubt, or restraint in another person, it is no longer neutral. It becomes directive. Recognizing this distinction is the first step toward reclaiming your ground. You begin trusting your internal response rather than dismissing it. You stop translating every gesture as instruction. Reclaiming power in these moments does not require confrontation. It requires grounding. You hold your posture. You complete your thought. You allow your presence to remain steady, regardless of unspoken signals. When you stop reacting to silent judgment, it loses its leverage. The body, once used to unsettle you, becomes just another form of expression, no longer the authority over your voice, but simply part of the room. Reclaiming power through inner clarity. Power is not always taken from you. Sometimes it is slowly handed away in moments of confusion, in the quiet effort to keep peace, in the habit of doubting yourself before anyone else does. After prolonged exposure to silence, ambiguity, emotional distance, and unspoken judgment, the mind adapts. It becomes careful, it becomes alert, it becomes trained to look outward for cues before trusting inward signals. This is not weakness, it is a learned response to an environment where clarity was consistently withheld. And the first step toward reclaiming power is understanding that nothing about you was broken in the process. Inner clarity does not arrive through confrontation, it arrives through recognition. The moment you stop asking, "What did I do wrong?" and begin asking, "Why am I assuming fault without evidence?" something shifts. You notice how often you explain yourself when no explanation is required. How often you soften your truth to prevent discomfort that is not yours to manage. How often you mistake confusion for guilt. These realizations are quiet, but they are decisive. They return authority to where it belongs, within you. As clarity strengthens, behavior changes naturally. You stop rushing to fill silence. You allow pauses to exist without translating them into meaning. You speak without rehearsing every sentence for safety. You no longer measure the value of your words by someone else's reaction. This does not make you distant or unkind. It makes you grounded. Grounded people do not need to dominate a room, and they do not need approval to stand firmly in their perspective. Their presence is calm because it is not contingent. One of the most powerful shifts that occurs with inner clarity is the release of emotional over-responsibility. You realize that it is not your role to manage another person's comfort at the expense of your authenticity. You stop carrying the weight of unspoken expectations. You stop translating mixed signals into personal failure. You understand that clarity is not created by guessing, it is created by self-trust. And when self-trust is restored, manipulation of any kind loses its entry point. This clarity also reshapes boundaries. Not the kind that are announced dramatically, but the kind that are lived quietly. You choose when to engage and when to step back. You no longer chase alignment with those who thrive on ambiguity. You allow relationships to reveal themselves without forcing understanding. And in doing so, you regain time, energy, and emotional space that were once spent decoding silence and managing uncertainty. What emerges is not hardness, but steadiness. You remain open, but no longer exposed. You remain empathetic, but no longer self-erasing. You listen without absorbing. You observe without internalizing. This balance is the mark of true inner authority. It does not require explanation. It does not seek validation. It simply exists, rooted, aware, and self-directed. In the end, reclaiming power is not about winning an invisible battle. It is about stepping out of it entirely. When you no longer participate in the quiet games of doubt and self-correction, they end on their own. You stand clear, not because the world has changed, but because you have. And that clarity, calm, silent, unwavering, is the strongest position you will ever hold.